I never imagined that the man who once erased me from his life with a signature would one day return, not with confidence, but with hesitation disguised as nostalgia. The message appeared on my phone on an ordinary evening, the kind of evening I had learned to enjoy in silence, and yet it disturbed something deep inside me that I thought had long settled. 5 years had passed since the divorce, 5 years of rebuilding myself from emotional rubble, and still, just seeing his name was enough to remind me how completely a person can be dismantled by someone they trusted. What struck me most was not the message itself, but the assumption behind it. That time had softened the damage, that I might still be the same woman he left behind, quietly waiting for his return. When I think back to our marriage, I don't remember grand betrayals at first. I remember small disappointments that piled up slowly, almost invisibly. I remember believing that love meant patience, that support meant standing behind someone even when they stopped standing beside you. I adjusted my life around his ambitions, convinced myself that my needs were secondary, temporary, negotiable. I ignored the way his tone changed when he spoke to me, the way he stopped asking for my opinion, the way my presence became expected rather than appreciated. I told myself that every marriage goes through phases, never realizing that I was slowly being written out of my own story. As his career flourished, his respect for me quietly evaporated. He began to speak to me like someone who had outgrown his surroundings, as if I were a reminder of a version of himself he wanted to forget. When arguments happened, they were never resolved, they were dismissed. My concerns were labeled emotional, irrational, unnecessary. I learned to swallow words before they reached my mouth, not because I agreed with him, but because it felt pointless to argue with someone who had already decided that my voice carried no weight. By the time I understood that I was lonely inside my own marriage, he was already emotionally elsewhere. The divorce did not come as a shock, but it still shattered me. He presented it like a business decision, calculated, clean, inevitable. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years I had invested, no gratitude for the sacrifices I had made. Walking away seemed effortless for him, while for me it felt like learning how to breathe again after years underwater. Friends offered sympathy at first, then gradually drifted away when my pain became inconvenient. Society has little patience for women who don't bounce back quickly enough. I was expected to be strong immediately, to accept the ending with grace, to move on as if my life had not just been split in two. Those early years after the divorce were the hardest of my life. I lived modestly, worked relentlessly, and questioned myself constantly. There were nights when exhaustion mixed with self, doubt so deeply that I wondered if he had been right to leave, if I really had been holding him back. But slowly, through effort rather than inspiration, I discovered something powerful. I was capable of building a life without being diminished inside it. I gained confidence not from validation, but from survival. Every achievement, no matter how small, belonged entirely to me. By the time he reached out again, I was no longer the woman he remembered. I had learned boundaries. I had learned the difference between love and dependency. I had learned that being chosen once does not obligate you to remain available forever. His message spoke of reflection, of missing what we had, of mistakes made in the past. But beneath those words was a familiar tone, the expectation that I would listen, understand, forgive. What he didn't realize was that forgiveness does not automatically mean access, and growth does not rewind time. Seeing his name again did not reopen old wounds. It confirmed how far I had come. He returned because something in his life had failed to replace what he lost. He returned because the woman he thought he could discard had become someone he could no longer control. And while he believed this was a second chance at an old story, I understood something he hadn't yet accepted, that some endings exist not to be corrected, but to be learned from. When I finally agreed to meet him, it wasn't curiosity that guided me, but clarity. I wanted to see with my own eyes whether the man standing in front of me was truly changed, or simply stripped of the confidence that once made him feel untouchable. We chose a quiet cafe, neutral territory, far removed from the places that carried our shared history. When he walked in, I recognized him instantly, yet something essential was missing. His posture was familiar, his face older, but the certainty he once carried like armor was gone. For the first time, I saw hesitation in his movements, as if he were unsure whether he still had the right to occupy space in my presence. He began talking almost immediately, filling the silence with memories, selective ones, moments where we laughed, traveled, dreamed. He spoke as if those memories belonged only to him now, as if recalling them might restore what he had destroyed. I listened without interrupting, noticing how he avoided mentioning the divorce directly, how he framed our separation as something that happened, rather than something he chose. When he finally admitted that his life hadn't turned out the way he expected, there was a brief flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, but it felt rehearsed, like a confession offered too late to matter. As he spoke, I realized something unsettlingly simple. He missed how I made his life easier, not who I was. He missed the stability, the emotional safety, the quiet support he had once taken for granted. He talked about his failures, his loneliness, the relationships that followed me and never worked out, yet never once asked how the divorce had affected me. That absence spoke louder than any apology could have. Growth requires awareness, and he was still standing at the center of his own narrative, expecting the world, and me, to orbit around him. I responded calmly, carefully choosing words that reflected truth rather than resentment. I told him about the woman I became after he left, not to impress him, but to establish distance between who I was and who he remembered. I spoke of independence, of peace, of learning to trust myself again. With each sentence, I watched his expression shift from hope to disbelief. It was as if he were slowly understanding that the version of me he had returned for no longer existed. That realization unsettled him more than rejection ever could. He asked if I ever thought about us, if I wondered what might have happened if things had gone differently. I told him honestly that I had, but not in the way he imagined. I thought about us as a lesson, not a loss. I explained that loving him had taught me endurance, but losing him had taught me self-respect. For a moment he was silent, perhaps realizing that this conversation was not unfolding according to his expectations. He had come seeking comfort, absolution, maybe even redemption, but what he found instead was accountability. When we parted ways that evening, there was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no emotional collapse. There was simply understanding, mine, not his. I walked away feeling lighter, not because I had rejected him, but because I had faced the past without allowing it to reclaim me. I knew then that whatever part 3 of this story held, it would no longer be shaped by his regrets, but by my boundaries. After that meeting, something inside me shifted in a way I had not anticipated, not because of anything he said, but because of what I finally saw with complete clarity. For years, I had replayed our marriage in my mind, examining my own actions, my silences, my compromises, wondering where I might have failed, wondering if loving more or demanding less could have saved us. But sitting across from him, watching him struggle to accept the reality of who I had become, I understood that the end of our marriage was not a misunderstanding or a tragedy caused by poor communication. It was the inevitable result of imbalance. He had not loved me as an equal, and without equality, love slowly turns into ownership, expectation, and eventually neglect. In the days that followed, he began reaching out more frequently, as if one meeting had reopened a door he believed was never truly closed. Messages arrived carefully worded, polite on the surface, but heavy with implication. He asked how I was feeling, whether I had thought more about our conversation, whether we could meet again and talk properly. What struck me was the subtle urgency behind his tone, the sense that he was running out of time, not because I had given him a deadline, but because he could feel control slipping away. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to him. I was observing him, and that distance gave me power I never knew I had. As I reflected on my life after the divorce, I realized how much of my strength had been built in solitude. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden moment of triumph. It was years of waking up early when I was tired, of continuing when I felt invisible, of choosing discipline over despair. I had learned to sit with my own thoughts, to confront my fears without needing reassurance, to build routines that supported my peace rather than disrupted it. That version of me could not coexist with the dynamic we once had, and deep down, I knew that any attempt to return would require me to unlearn everything I had fought to become. When I finally replied to him, my words were calm but deliberate. I told him that while I appreciated his honesty, I was not interested in revisiting the past under the illusion of nostalgia. I explained that growth had changed my priorities, that love without respect was no longer something I could accept, and that reopening old wounds in the hope of a different outcome felt irresponsible to the life I had built. His response was immediate and emotional. He spoke of regret, of realizing too late what he had lost, of being haunted by memories of our life together. But regret, I had learned, is not the same as accountability. Wanting something back does not mean you are prepared to care for it properly. As his messages continued, they became more revealing. At times, he praised my strength and independence, framing them as qualities he had always admired, as if history could be rewritten with compliments. At other moments, frustration slipped through, subtle accusations that I was being cold, unforgiving, unwilling to acknowledge his efforts. That oscillation between admiration and entitlement was familiar, and it confirmed what I already knew. He wanted reassurance without responsibility, connection without change. The difference now was that I recognized the pattern, and recognition made it impossible to fall back into it. There were moments of temptation, moments when loneliness whispered that reconciliation might offer comfort, familiarity, even validation. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by the memory of who I was when I last belonged to him. Uncertain, diminished, constantly adjusting myself to avoid conflict. I reminded myself that peace earned through self-respect is quieter than the chaos of longing, but infinitely more sustainable. Love, I realized, should feel like expansion, not contraction. Eventually, I told him clearly that I was not open to rebuilding a romantic relationship. I did not accuse him, insult him, or reopen old arguments. I simply stated my truth and held to it. His silence afterward was long and heavy, the kind of silence that signals not understanding, but defeat. And for the first time, I felt compassion without obligation. I wished him well without offering myself as a solution to his dissatisfaction. What surprised me most was not his reaction, but my own sense of closure. I no longer needed him to acknowledge his mistakes for me to move forward. I no longer needed validation from the person who once withheld it so freely. The story had completed its arc within me, not because he returned, but because I had changed enough to meet the past without losing myself to it. In the weeks that followed my decision, life did not suddenly become easier or lighter in any dramatic way, but it became clearer, and clarity has its own quiet power. I noticed how my mornings felt calmer without the weight of unresolved history pressing on my thoughts, how my evenings were no longer interrupted by messages that carried expectations I did not agree to fulfill. There was a sense of finality in knowing that I had chosen myself without cruelty and without apology. That choice reshaped the way I saw not only him, but every relationship that had ever demanded my silence as the price of belonging. He reached out one last time, not with anger, but with a carefully measured tone that suggested acceptance while still searching for a crack in my resolve. He said he respected my decision, that he wished things had been different, that perhaps timing had been cruel to both of us. Reading those words, I understood something fundamental about timing and responsibility. Timing does not abandon people. People abandon each other when convenience outweighs commitment. I did not reply to that message, not out of spite, but because some conversations end not with a final sentence, but with restraint. As months passed, I began to reflect more deeply on the version of myself that existed within the marriage and the version that emerged after it ended. The difference was not confidence alone, but awareness. I had learned how easily love can become conditional, how praise can replace partnership, and how quickly a woman's sacrifices are forgotten once they are no longer required. These realizations were not bitter, they were grounding. They allowed me to move forward with intention rather than hope alone. I started to notice how often women are taught to interpret endurance as virtue, how we are praised for staying quiet, staying loyal, staying flexible, even when flexibility slowly bends into self-erasure. My marriage had been a lesson written over years, and my divorce had been the examination that forced me to confront what I had learned. I passed that test not by rebuilding the past, but by refusing to repeat it. That refusal became the foundation of my peace. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, triggered by familiar places or fragments of music we once shared. But those memories no longer carried longing, they carried perspective. I could see our relationship clearly now, without romantic filters or self-blame. I saw two people who wanted different things from love, moving in opposite directions while pretending they were still aligned. Understanding that freed me from the illusion that reconciliation would somehow heal what was fundamentally incompatible. What mattered most was not that he wanted me back, but that I no longer needed him to want me at all. That shift altered the balance of every emotional equation in my life. I became more selective, more present, less willing to negotiate my boundaries for comfort. Love, I decided, would have to meet me where I stood, not ask me to return to where I had been wounded. By the time his presence faded completely from my daily life, there was no sense of loss, only completion. I did not reclaim my power through confrontation or victory, but through consistency, by choosing the same truth every day until it became natural. The woman he left behind no longer existed, and the woman he returned for was never available to him. That was not revenge, that was growth. Time has a way of revealing patterns that emotion once hid from me. As my life continued to move forward without his presence, I began to notice how deeply my sense of self had been shaped by years of being measured against someone else's expectations. Freedom, I learned, is not just the absence of another person. It is the absence of the need to explain yourself, to justify your choices, to shrink your truth so that someone else can remain comfortable. Living alone did not make me lonely. It made me honest. Every decision I made was mine. Every mistake belonged to me, and every success carried no shadow of comparison. People often assume that after a painful divorce, the next chapter must involve another love, as if healing requires replacement. But for a long time, I was not interested in being chosen again. I was interested in choosing myself repeatedly, even when it felt unfamiliar. I rebuilt friendships that had faded during my marriage, discovered interests I once dismissed as impractical, and learned how to enjoy silence without interpreting it as emptiness. There was a quiet dignity in knowing that my happiness no longer depended on whether someone else approved of my life. Ironically, it was during this period of stability that he attempted to reinsert himself indirectly, through mutual acquaintances and subtle inquiries. I heard that he spoke of me with admiration now, that he described me as strong, intelligent, irreplaceable. Hearing those words secondhand stirred no pride in me, only clarity. Appreciation that arrives after loss is rarely generous, it is usually reflective. He valued me now because he could feel the absence of what I once provided so effortlessly. But I had learned that being valued only when gone is not the same as being cherished when present. There were moments when I questioned whether my firmness was mistaken for coldness, whether refusing reconciliation made me unforgiving. But forgiveness, I realized, does not require reopening doors that once led to pain. It requires releasing resentment, not responsibility. I had forgiven him long ago, quietly, for my own peace. What I refused to do was grant him access to a version of me he had never protected when he had the chance. As I grew more comfortable in my independence, new connections entered my life naturally, without force or urgency. Conversations felt balanced, respect was mutual. I noticed how different it felt to be listened to without interruption, to be considered without negotiation. These experiences did not excite me in the way youthful romance once had. They grounded me. They showed me that love could exist without instability, without fear, without the constant need to prove worth. Looking back, I understood that my ex-husband's return was never about reconciliation. It was about contrast. He saw who I had become and measured it against his own unresolved dissatisfaction. That comparison unsettled him. But my growth was not a response to his failure. It was a response to my own survival. I did not rebuild myself to be missed. I rebuilt myself to be whole. By the time his name no longer triggered memory or reaction, I knew that the chapter was closing not with bitterness, but with understanding. Some people are meant to be part of your life only long enough to teach you what you will never tolerate again. And some endings are not losses, but corrections. By the time everything finally settled, I understood that closure is not an event, but a state of mind that arrives only when you stop negotiating with the past. My life no longer felt like a recovery process. It felt like ownership. Every choice I made carried intention rather than reaction, and that distinction changed the way I experienced the world. I was no longer defining myself by what had ended, but by what I was building with patience and self-respect. The divorce, once the loudest moment of my existence, had become a quiet reference point rather than a wound. What surprised me most was how little I needed his acknowledgement anymore. There was a time when I imagined an apology would heal me, that accountability from him would validate my pain. But healing arrived without his participation. It arrived through consistency, through showing up for myself every day, through refusing to abandon my own needs the way I once had. I realized that waiting for someone who hurt you to understand the damage they caused is another form of dependency, and I had outgrown that. As I stepped fully into this new chapter, my standards became non-negotiable. I no longer confused attention with effort or familiarity with safety. I understood that love should feel stable, not suspenseful, supportive rather than consuming. When people entered my life now, they met a woman who knew her worth without announcing it, who listened carefully but did not overextend, who offered warmth without surrendering boundaries. This version of me was not hardened by pain, but refined by experience. Occasionally, I heard updates about him. Career changes, a failed engagement, a restless search for meaning. But those details no longer carried emotional weight. His life and mine had fully diverged, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. We were no longer walking parallel paths, and that separation felt natural rather than forced. I wished him no harm, but I also wished him no return. What remained was gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for the clarity it produced. That marriage taught me how easily love can be mistaken for obligation, how often women are praised for endurance instead of fulfillment, and how dangerous it is to stay loyal to someone who is no longer loyal to your well-being. Those lessons shaped every future decision I made, ensuring that I would never again trade peace for the illusion of partnership. In the end, the most powerful truth I learned was this: someone wanting you back does not mean they deserve you again. Desire without responsibility is just regret in disguise, and I was no longer a place for regret to land. I was a life moving forward, grounded, intentional, and complete on my own terms.